Hello, my continuously creative quilting friends. Today is Wednesday. It's day 20 of our shelter at home orders, and it's 2 o'clock. And so here I am, Facebook Live, 2 o'clock every day. I'm so excited that you're joining me, and I hope that you're learning a lot along our journey. I'd love to share things that I know and help you guys get along in your getting better at your quilting. So I was showing you this quilt yesterday, the doing the hand binding, but I didn't actually show you the whole quilt. This is also the quilt last week that we did borders on. And it's actually a quilt. It's called Swoon by Thimble Blossoms. And it's actually a quilt that I had pieced the top part of it without the borders probably about 4 or 5 years ago. It's been a long time. And so I've been sitting, waiting for borders, waiting for me to quilt it. And putting the borders on with you guys last week just really inspired me to get her done. So I'm going to scoot it up a little bit so that you can see the quilting on it. I did just an all over kind of a textury design. It's called Garden Trellis. The designer is Carly Porter, and it just really gave a lot of nice, fun texture to the quilt. So I love all of the different color star blocks on this quilt. I've got almost one whole side of the binding down. Probably going to have to watch a few movies to get that one finished. I always say can tell like how big a quilt is by how many movies I have to watch while I quilt the binding. So this one's probably at, I don't know, probably a 3 or 4 movie binding. So anyway, yesterday when we were talking about the binding, we also talked a little bit about if you ever enter your quilt into a competition, what kind of things the judges are looking for. Now, whenever I mention to people about entering quilts into a quilt show to be judged, they get real kind of back off, like, ain't nobody gonna judge my work. Like, I don't want no quilt police telling me what I did wrong. But let me tell you guys, it is actually really a fun thing to do. It's really fun to go look at them. And if people are too afraid to put their quilts in, people that aren't quilters that like to go look at them and be inspired or just see what we're doing out there wouldn't have anything to see. So I highly encourage you to at least start thinking about entering something that you've made, a quilt that you've made in a quilt show. And in our local area, there's lots of national shows that are definitely geared toward very prolific quilters that do a lot of quilting and do the real intricate stuff. But locally, you can always go to your local county fairs. They always have a quilt exhibit show as part of their exhibits. They usually have like a crocheting arts section, painting. There's all kinds of arts that people have made that get on display, and they do get judged. Now, when I say that a quilt is going to get judged, that really sets people off to be like, I don't want people to judge my stuff. But I think we need to have a little bit different perspective of what that means. That doesn't necessarily mean that somebody's going, oh, look at, she didn't do that, and she didn't do this, and she didn't do that. No, it's more about giving you feedback to be like, okay, here's an area maybe you could strive to do a little bit better in. But then they also always turn around and put positive things in there too, like really nice job on your straight borders, or really nice job on your choice of colors, that kind of thing. They always try to put something that's also going to edify the quilt, tell you that you did a good job. So anyway, I have started being part of that competition committee that is part of the Colorado Quilt Council. So it's very official, and they do a really nice job of having meetings and telling us these are the kinds of things that we're looking for when we're judging quilts. So the process is, in order to become a quilt judge, you have to observe a lot of quilt judgings and a lot of um, different quilts and just seeing how they're judged. So we always at the meetings bring quilts in and talk about them. And then you have to be, in order to get all of those viewings of the quilts in, you have to be a scribe, who's the person that writes down all of the things that the judges say. Because when the judges go to the competitions to judge, sometimes they have like a stack of like 80 quilts that they have to get through within a day or half a day and say, this one's the winner. Now, probably you're thinking, if you walk into a quilt show and you see which quilts won ribbons and you look at it and you go, well, that's not the one I would have picked. But let me tell you, there's a very systematic way of judging the quilts. It's not always about just the one that is going to grab your eye and grab your attention. Sometimes there's a very beautiful quilt at first glance, but when you start looking at it, it's poorly constructed, or something else is off about it that has been judged. So it's a very technical, very objective. It's not a subjective thing. It's not the judge lays all the quilts out and looks at them and go, oh, I think that one's the prettiest one, I'm going to give it a ribbon. No, 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 no. That is not how it works. It's very systematic. We actually have a sheet that we go through and we look at the different criteria and mark off if that's present or missing in the quilt. So I just wanted to go through really quick and read you some of these things so that if you think this is something that you would like to do, and like I said, I really encourage you to consider it and to put your quilts in the shows. This is the kind of stuff that you need to be thinking about as you're working on the quilt, the things that are going to be looked at. So the very first thing that the judge is going to look at is the piecing, the actual basic start out construction of your quilt. So that's why a couple of weeks ago I talked about the importance and the accuracy of your 1/4 inch seam, because that's what's going to make the big difference in how well the quilt is pieced. So these are the things, I just want to show you this little box. So those are the things that we look for. So you see they have little check box by them. You actually get this form back with your quilt. So you would know exactly what areas that you need to work on and improve on. So I think it's a great tool to help improve your skills. So in the piecing section, it says the general construction is precise, corners are square, points are retained, and the intersections match. So that's just very basic, where your corners are, they're square, where your points come to the corner of your block. I'll show you in a darker color. Then there's actually a point. Your point's not hiding underneath the seam, or some people say the points are cut off. Okay, so that's something that they look for. And that the intersections match. So when your blocks come together, those intersections, the top block matches the bottom block, and they're not like off a bit. Thread color blends or matches fabric. Now remember, this is in the piecing, not the quilting part. So when you're piecing, it's very important to use either a matching color of thread or something very neutral that's not going to show. For sure, don't put like bright neon blue on white fabric, because that's going to show through in your seam. So that would get a check mark. So if one of these boxes gets marked off, then that means that was not present in the quilt. Those were the areas that needed to improve on. Piecing, sashing if you have sashing around your blocks, those all line up. Like I do have sashing in between those stars. So there's white space. Those points in the star, 2 different color stars don't come together. There's sashing in there. So each row, the sashing rows are going to all line up. They're not going to be off. That's something they look at. And if there's any curve piecing, that it's going to be nice and smooth. So depending on how many check marks you get off on that will determine whether that category gets an excellent, a very good, a good, improvement needed, or just if it's not applicable, like if it's the whole quilt is appliqued, then maybe there was no piecing, so it would be get an NA, and that doesn't mark against you. It's just not there. So applique, I'm going to read through the rest of these kind of quickly. Applique, that there's no shadowing of dark fabrics under the light fabrics. The turned edge motifs securely attached without puckers. Repeated motifs are consistent in size and placement. Raw edge or decorative applique stitching is secure and consistent in width and density. Curves smooth, points sharp, and appropriate thread colors. So those are the things they look for in applique. When it comes to applying borders, they are looking for if your long seams are straight with no distortion, no wavy lines in your border. The borders are well designed to complement the center of the quilt. Good construction with no ripples or puckers, and consistent in width and density all along. And let's see. So then, okay, so that's the third category. Next is quilting. Now this is all workmanship part of the quilt. And like I said, it's very objective. Quilting is even and consistent stitch length front and back. This is hand or machine. Correct tension is maintained on the front and the back. Ditch quilting is precisely stitched in the ditch. This is why when people bring me custom quilts and say, oh, will you just stitch in the ditch? That's not as easy as it sounds, because it's very difficult to actually get that stitch right in the ditch. No pleats, bubbles, or distortion caused by the quilting on the front or the back. Quilted grids and straight lines are precise, curves are smooth, and points are sharp. No visible knots or stops or starts. And the thread color enhances the quilt. Finishing, here's the binding part I was talking about yesterday. Binding or facing is filled to the edge with batting. Edge finish is appropriate for the intended use of the piece. That kind of gets more into if you do like decorative type bindings. Mitered binding corners are stitched closed front and back, like we talked about yesterday. Miters in the border align with miters in the binding at the corners. If you miter the border corner, that line needs to follow right up to the point with the binding. Outer edges of quilt are straight with no waviness on the finished edge. Corners are precisely 90 degrees. Irregular or shaped edges are neatly handled, like if you do have like a scallop type edge. Binding is consistent in width, and all stitching is secure. So here's the story that I want to share with you about how this helped me with my binding. When I first started quilting, I'd always sewn ever since I was like in second grade. And when I first started quilting and I attached my binding, I didn't know how to do the binding stitch on the back. And the only thing I knew hand sewing something down was like when you hem a skirt. So I actually had like a hemming stitch going all the way around the back of my quilt in the first quilt that I entered in a competition. And I didn't even, so you could see that running, if you do like a by hand hem where you like catch the loop each time you go through. So there was actually a line of thread running all along the binding. And so obviously, they made a comment about how I needed to review the proper way to stitch down a binding. And if I hadn't entered my quilt in that show, probably to this day, I would still be doing, well, hopefully I would have learned by now, but that was how I learned that I was not doing the right stitch on the back of my quilt to stitch down my binding. So I'm really grateful for that. And it was a good learning. And, it's not a thing to get feathers ruffled about, because it's just an objective. This is not the way you stitch down a binding. So that's my story about how entering quilts in the competition have really helped me become a better quilter. And then it moves on. The next category in the workmanship category is any special techniques. If there's embroidery, ties, beading, embellishment, overlays, trapunto, photo transfer, paint, crystal buttons, foiling, that they're all appropriate use for the piece. Like they're not just on there to just make it look more blingy, but it actually fits what you're trying to convey in the quilt. Special techniques enhance the top and are compatible with all other design elements. Stitching is neatly done with no distortion, and the embellishments are well secured. One time I put buttons all over a quilt, like in the middle of all these little blocks that I had made, and one of them fell off like during the judging, so I got dinged for that. They were not secure, so you want to make sure they're secure. Then the second thing that they start looking at is the actual appearance and the design. Now, this is where you would think it could get a little bit more subjective, and maybe a little bit it does, but it still has criteria. So quilt judges spend a lot of time learning about design, proper design elements, proper color, visual impact of things. They've had us looking at like art books and art study and stuff like that, because it's all very closely related. So in the appearance and design of the quilt, what they're looking for, first of all, is your visual impact. Like, do the colors and the values, are they well chosen and well placed? You get the contrast that you're trying to look for? Is there good scale and proportion of all the design elements? Hi, Eve. Is there unity of style and presentation? Let's see, unity of style and presentation is created with all design components. You get that it all ties together, it's all cohesive. Is there pleasing composition with effective use of line and shape? The design is interesting, tells a story or evokes a feeling, or draws viewers in for a closer look. So even though looking at design can be a little bit more subjective, it still has very objective points. Okay, quilting patterns. Now, the first quilting category we looked at was the actual workmanship of the quilting, like were the stitches even, were there too many knots, and all that kind of a thing. Now we're actually looking at the quilting patterns as they come across as part of the design. So do the motifs that are quilted fill and quilted fills complement and reinforce the top design? So does it enhance it? Does it add to the overall look of the design of the quilt? Is the amount of quilting sufficient and appropriate for the design? The density of quilting is reasonably maintained throughout the quilt. This is something that I've had checked off and had to go back and reevaluate my, like, especially in custom quilting, like, did I quilt it too densely over here and it's too open in this area? Like, they're really looking for a reasonably maintained amount of quilting throughout. Quilted motifs and patterns are precisely placed and appropriate. And then the very last thing is your quilt is the general appearance. Is it clean? Is it neat? Like, you don't ever want to send a quilt that has a stain on it. You'll for sure get marked off on that. It's free of pet hair, lint, soil, stains, or odors. Make sure your quilt don't stink. Because if the quilt judge smells it, she'll be like, no. And then if you had to mark any lines in it for quilting or whatever, that all of those lines have been removed, and that there's no excess or loose threads. So those are the things that they look for. Then they have at the bottom an area that usually a judge will leave a comment about your design or or workmanship. So there again, that's where they usually will add in, great job on color choices, or great job on, evoking a feeling of home if you did a bunch of houses or something. They'll put some kind of encouraging comment on there as well. So I think I have just loved going and looking at people's quilts. So please enter your quilts in so that we can see them, because we really do enjoy it. And you'll learn and grow as a quilter. So it's a fun thing to do. I think that's all I have for you guys today. And I really enjoy you coming and being here with me. Be continuously creative. Make some quilts for hopefully we'll have county fairs this summer. And I'll see you guys tomorrow at 2:00. Bye.